journalism has turned into something else. It's turned into show business. It's turned into commentary. It's turned into a lot of things. Everybody who has a phone now is a publisher. So that's part of the problem.
Well, with all this disruption in the media, and it is a problem, do you see any rays of hope for citizen journalists, people who want to be part of the change and using whatever platforms they do have?
Well, yes, in fact, I do see some good things. The problem is you have to search for it, though. I mean, there's so much information coming through social media and everything else that you have to decide what is true and what is not true, what is real, what is not real. And that's difficult for people. And sadly, we have a population now that really only wants to hear from a certain side of an issue, of a problem. They have a media that they depend on, and they only go to that media. They don't look at a lot of different media and then decide how to judge them. So that's part of the problem, is that we have an unsophisticated public who's fooled daily by people who represent themselves as media people. And they are, because they have a platform somewhere. They're on the radio, they're on maybe some cable television station or something, but we're not getting truth as much as I think we ought to get.
Well, absolutely. As a student of media and a storyteller myself, I understand the distinction between someone who's a true journalist and the training and experience that they have. And that's why your voice matters so much in this. And especially as our society is wrestling with this national upheaval, and rightly so, about the protests that are coming from the deaths of people like George Floyd, it's more important than ever that we know how to use our voices in a constructive way to move the national dialogue forward. So how do we do that in this landscape?
Well, in fact, this landscape ought to give us another reason to do what I did when I became a journalist. I became a journalist because I saw what media could do. It was in the middle of the civil rights movement. I was living under Jim Crow laws, and I saw what television could do. I saw what the newspapers could do. They could tell our story to the world. When the children of Birmingham came out and started marching in the streets, left school and started marching in the streets, and then we saw photos of them being bitten by dogs and beaten with batons and fire hoses turned on them. That told a story. And that's when I said, I've got to help tell this story.
And you've been telling stories ever since you were in high school. Some of your colleagues have told me they remember you at I Am Terrell as that guy even then.
Yes, indeed. I mean, some of my family members, they knew that I wanted to be a writer, at least as far back as the 5th grade. I knew by 7th grade that I was probably going to go in some form of journalism. And by 9th grade, I decided that I was going to major in journalism, even though technically there was nobody to hire me, because Black people weren't allowed to be journalists, or at least not with major publications or with any radio or television station. There were some Black newspapers, of course, that you could go to, but no, I mean, and my father said, why would you want to major in a subject where you can't get hired? And luckily, as it turned out, by the time I got out of college, even though at the time I went in, nobody would hire me. By the time I came out, just about every newspaper decided they needed one. So it worked out.
Well, so you took that and ran with it, because from the stories I know of my parents and the people in that generation, you had quite a platform as a broadcast journalist up to KERA.
Yeah, I started, as it turned out, the day I graduated, I got hired by the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, my hometown newspaper, which didn't have a reputation of printing stories about Black people. The story was that the only way you could get your picture in the paper, and I think I may have told you this, is that if you had killed a white man or raped a white woman. So when my father first saw my name and my picture on the front page of the paper, he had to go around and say, hey, wait a minute here. I got to call the neighbors because they're going to think you killed somebody. And so he was explaining, he wrote the story, folks. Your first impression may be, what did he do? He wrote the story. But then I went on to Channel 13, and got great experience there in public television, learned to become a documentary filmmaker as well as producer for live television. So that really changed. And then I came back to the Star Telegram as a columnist. So I was giving my opinions.
Well, I was fortunate to visit your website and see some of the documentaries over the years that you've produced or participated in, and the passion does come through. And I think that has been really important throughout this series of getting to hear from other civil rights pioneers, just that the personal conviction of the stories, and even now following friends on social media of my African American friends, it's that conviction that they share in their stories that makes me want to act. And I'm wondering now what you think about the current media situation, if that's at least something positive we can look to with social media.
One of my criticisms of the media today is that those telling the stories are so interested in themselves that they get in the way of the storytelling. You look at some person who's standing in the same spot all day long, and they go to them for the live shot. They have no time to do any real investigation of a story, but they're on camera and they're telling a story, and not so much the story of the person they ought to be telling it. I was lucky enough when I came along that even though I had my critics, because some people didn't like the kinds of stories I was telling, they certainly didn't like a lot of my opinions. The truth is, even though people didn't like some of the stories I was telling, they didn't like my opinions, certainly in many cases. They did understand my passion. They did respect the fact that I was really interested in this topic, whether it was criminal justice issues, the death penalty issues that I wrote about for so long, fighting those kinds of fights. And they knew that I believed in what I was doing. And so that credibility helped me tell the story.
Well, no doubt. So as you see others who are passionate and maybe not with access to the kind of training that you had, what guidelines could you equip citizen journalists with? Just a couple ideas that can help us all be more effective as we try to tell our stories.
The main thing is keep the focus on the topic or the individual that you're writing about. I usually tell people, and this is another thing I see often, I hear it on radio and television. As a rule, if your question is longer than their answer, except if you say yes or no, there's something bad happening there. The idea is to solicit their input, get stuff out of their minds, out of their heads, and let them tell it for you. I mean, I can tell it, but I want to tell it through the person that I'm writing about. When I was at Channel 13, I would tell people, I said, okay, we got a city budget story, and they would come on and they would say, oh, the city is asking for this much money in the budget. I say, okay, so where are the people in this budget story? I mean, if they're cutting a budget over here, that means they're cutting something that would have been going to somebody, some community. Well, find me those people. Tell me that budget story through people, not just through numbers. And that was always my emphasis. If there's an issue, find me a person who represents that issue and tell it to me. There may be two sides, there may be 3 or 4 sides to it. Give me all the sides that you can give me.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is the art of listening. It's that you've mastered that.
The art of listening. And in fact, when I tell a young journalist, and they'll write their questions down, and they'll be so tuned into their question that they don't hear your answer. So you may say something and that would automatically, for me, evoke another question based on what you just said. But because I'm going to question number 2, I don't get to that question. And that's what I said, people do not listen well.
No, they don't. And so I think that I'm sort of listening now, and I've forgotten my next question because I was so entranced. But what I do want to kind of bring it back to is thank you for those guidelines on how to be more effective mediums for today's current kind of conversation. What about the importance of historical storytelling that we've been exploring in our biographical series on civil rights leaders?
Well, it's interesting because when I used to do stories that reflected on my childhood or the conditions under which I grew up, and mentioned the whole idea of racism and segregation, I used to hear from a lot of people says, we don't want to hear that. That's past. That's not having an effect on anybody else. I said, no, you must hear that history. You must know the history. And you must know that we're still have an impact from that history on our lives today. I mean, we're still dealing with some of those same issues in different forms, for sure. But, race helped shape this nation. I mean, it did. I mean, one way or the other, whether you were on the good side or the bad side or indifferent or whatever, it had an impact on all parts of our life, all segments of our life. And it still is. So you got to know that history. You need to tell it. And I tell people, particularly young Black people and Hispanics, I said, you got to know your own history. You got to know what people went through so that you can be here.
If they're not in the media, then I am at least glad that there are institutions like the Black Chamber and this museum. And, what places should we be looking for more information about our own heritage?
Well, I mean, and that's what, first of all, they don't teach anymore. But, I mean, just this past year, the Fort Worth Independent School District has come up with a curriculum on African-American history. So that's happening. The book that I did on Calvin Littlejohn is in every school library now. Now, I don't know how many people will actually look at it and read it, but it's there. We were lucky when we were coming along. We had teachers who had that interest. And even though it was not part of the curriculum, they made it a part of the curriculum. They made us know. They put books in our hands that technically were banned in the Fort Worth School District. James Baldwin and Langston Hughes were not supposed to be on the reading list in Fort Worth Public Schools when I was coming up. But a teacher put that in my hand, said, you want to be a writer, you need to know Langston Hughes. You want to be a writer, you need to know James Baldwin.
So many of the people who sat here and spoke to you during the series have gone back to some teacher who made the impact.
Without a doubt.
That's incredible. It's just a good reminder that it's not really about everyone else giving us that history. It's just us looking to maybe the person in our local kind of schools or just people we interact with daily and seeing what we can learn from them.
Well, and those teachers, and particularly those who mentioned I Am Terrell, which is where I went to school too, of course, those teachers knew that they were preparing us for a change that was coming. And they knew that in order for us to deal with that change that was coming, we had to be prepared. So they made sure that we were. They really did.
Well, you clearly are prepared, and you've done a great service to all of us by continuing to use that training that you've been developing for 40 years in moderating this series. And to the point about the libraries, I'm glad that you mentioned that because that's exactly where these interviews will be held.
Excellent.
Yes.
Excellent. And see, that's the beauty of this project. It'll be here, long, long after I'm gone. Long after you're gone, even though you're young, but it'll still be here. So if anybody wants to know, they can know.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the work that you've done to make this a success. We appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.